Give it a few seconds, and we are live. We are live.
Okay.
So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Greetings to the viewers. Would like to welcome you to this particular session that we, as these gentlemen, have thought it fit to share some of the views we have around some pertinent matters. So we have prayed for this particular session. I just wanted to give you an introduction of what basically we will be doing. We want to address the contentions around the ideology or the ideologies that come from what we define as Christianity, and also what we understand to be African traditional worldview. Of course, these ideologies have merits of their own, and would like to discuss what kind of convergence would we find from them, and what other divergences that we will see from them. And therefore, we felt the need to just engage as brothers. Those who are here with us today, it is Lumko Keswa, it is Tanti Mabenge, and Slanke Sidata.
Yes, sir.
And therefore, to welcome you all to this engagement and discussion. I'm not sure how we're going to go about it with regards to questions that will be asked in as we go ahead with the discussion. Singata.
Okay. I think the first thing we should discuss is defining some concepts, because we mentioned that we want to talk about Christianity. We mentioned that we want to talk about African traditional religion or worldviews. So maybe we need to define those two concepts first before we get into the other questions of what we will be discussing today.
Sure. No, that is in order. I'd like to create a disclaimer that these are our views, personal views. They do not represent our employers. They do not represent, or we have not received a mandate from them for us to engage on these topics. But we felt, as brothers who have studied theology, it is prudent of us to continuously engage on matters such as these ideologies, and therefore it should never be treated as representing our employers nor the places of employment that we come from. I guess we should kickstart this program by probably looking at Christianity. And what is Christianity? Of course, we need to first acknowledge that Christianity is a concept that is created outside of the Bible. And when I say it is created outside of the Bible, is that there is no expression of what Christianity is or how it should be defined in Scripture. You only find that it is always alluded to Christ. It is always alluded to expressions that Christ had given. And this is why you always look into the text and you find that when they say, what is Christianity? They often say it is a follower of Christ. It is one that follows Christ as a result of trying to be like Christ or trying to assimilate the character of Christ in one's life. And therefore, it becomes too tricky to then actually find in essence what Christianity is. I read somewhere that there was a question that was asked to an Indian philosopher. I think it was Muhammad Gandhi or someone, whereby the question was, why don't you become a Christian? Why don't you align yourself with the Christian church? And his response was, which one? And when I read it, I kept on asking myself, if a philosopher of that nature can ask which one, there are variations of Christianity that are found. And this is informed by the different histories and centuries that we come from. And therefore, it becomes difficult to then have a precise definition of what Christianity is. I read some also whereby they're able to say Christianity, according to what Paul defines as Christianity, is that it is the good news concerning a historical person. And that historical person is Christ. And because it is Christ, and because he is of a human history, it means that his birth or him being born is aligned with the lineage through the gift of David, but also that he demonstrated miracles. He demonstrated his extraordinary being, that of divinity. And therefore, that relation is combined to assimilate that to be a Christian, you need to have this combination of human aspect that is interlinked with with divinity in order to appear or in order to assimilate or in order to demonstrate the character of the one that is higher than all of us. And I wanted to check with you, gentlemen, what would be your definition of Christianity as it is complex to assimilate to establish one? Probably let's check with Pastor Mabenge.
Um, I got cut off there just a bit, but let me come in. I'm not too sure what you already covered, but I'm hoping that I'm not going to be stepping upon your views.
Sure.
I heard you talking about assimilation, which is, I think, one of the aspects of Christianity, to assimilate, looking at the life of Christ and its definition. But then when you look at society as a whole and you look at how everyone identifies themselves as Christian, you do not find people that are necessarily assimilating the life of Christ or some of the principles that Christ stood for in his life, even though they still identify themselves as Christians. So I think it makes it kind of difficult because when you put them in that same sphere, then you are calling everyone inside the definition, even though your definition itself is excluding some, because those who do not assimilate then do not belong in the definition of Christianity. But my biggest issue is that even our very mainstream churches, when they have political discourse and they decide to engage in mannerisms that are not Christ-like, where you find people physically fighting, where you find people insulting each other, throwing swear words at each other, do they suddenly stop being Christian, or are they still Christians covered in that same definition, but maybe there's an extension of the Christian definition that we need to put down there? So I think my own definition would be more than just assimilation, but also looking futuristically at the end result, that where do you want to end up? Do you want to end up with Christ? And I think that is where I would put my definition of Christianity, that the end line or the final line of your walk in this life and where you're going to is not only assimilating for an end in itself, but to actually get to a part where you are with Christ.
Thank you, Pastor Mabenge. And more than anything, as you clearly make mention, that it becomes too complex to actually be clear on a definition that is all inclusive. And this is also attached to the different ideologies and dogma that is created by churches. I mean, the question is, how many people can boldly say they are Christians? You'd find that there are a lot, but they differ in views expressed by the same Christ. And of course, as you clearly put it, the fundamental question we should also be asking ourselves is, if Christianity is all about Christ, then why are we aligning ourselves to other biblical expressions? Why are we aligning ourselves to the Old Testament? What is there that speaks to Christianity if only we are to follow Christ? And I guess, Pastor Keswa, you'd also come in here to try and give us your form of understanding of what Christianity may entail.
Thank you, Pastor Kilelwa. I think for me, Christianity is socio-cultural system um, that dictates or that governs or that guides how you go about living. It's a religion that stems primarily from the life of Christ. So if you subscribe yourself to who Christ is, and you subscribe to the teachings that we find in the New Testament that were taught by Jesus Christ, for me, I think then you qualify to be a Christian. Christianity is a state of mind. Christianity is a worldview. It determines how you treat yourself. It determines how you treat other people. Um, it is a yardstick of your spirituality. So for me, I think Christianity is a personal conviction that is founded on the precipice of Christ being God. I don't know if that makes sense for you, but I think for me that's basically what Christianity is for me. Affirmation of Christ being God, and immediately after that affirmation of Christ as God, then acceptance of him being a leader in your life then qualifies one to be a Christian.
Sure. Which would automatically afford one to have a life, which would afford one to subscribe to the teachings, to subscribe to the livelihood, which then creates a personal worldview of how to relate with Christ. Before I give
If I can come in there.
Sure.
Yeah. Like I agree fully. I agree fully with all of these definitions, no? But I think I need to come in before Pastor Singata comes in as well, so that maybe he can have something all-encompassing. What do we make of those that do not subscribe to a life that is guided or that shows certain characteristics of Christ, but they still identify themselves as Christians? Like if you'd watch the hip hop awards, you'd see the guys getting awards for all of these songs that are brutal, you know, where they are attacking each other, talking about killing, shooting, you know, hoes, all of those things. And then at the end of the day, when they receive the award, they say, I thank my Lord Jesus Christ for giving me this ability, displaying that they are giving credence to Christ as the one that guides them. But now, because we do not see those traits or characters, should we seclude them out of the definition of Christianity?
Maybe let me jump right in
That,
there. Oh, okay. I see you, Pastor
okay,
Kes.
no, you can take over, my lord.
Okay, all right, my lord. All right, my lord. And to those of you who are wondering why we call each other my lord, that's just how we refer to each other. So, anyway, I think to be sensitive to the question that Uta X, Pastor Mabenge just asked, and also to the question that we're of trying to define Christianity, I'll define it as briefly as I can in this way. Christianity is more than just a creed, a confession. It is that. It is a creed, it is a confession. But I think to call yourself a Christian is to say the way in which you perceive the world is in the light of an awareness that there's a God and you encounter God through the person of Jesus. Uh, so, if we're talking about people who are, should I say, less than ideal in terms of what we expect a Christian to be, we can still call them a Christian in the sense that the way they see the world, the way they experience the world, is in the shadow of or in the light of the awareness or the belief that there is a God and this God is experienced through the person of Jesus. So being a Christian is a very complicated thing. It doesn't mean moral perfection. It doesn't even mean political perfection or what not. But maybe there's a sense in which it refers to a way in which you experience the world uh, through the lens which is Jesus Christ and encountering God through that Jesus. Maybe that's how I would define it.
So in essence, my lord, I think if I hear you correctly, you are saying Christianity is a worldview, basically.
Pretty
Or am
much,
I wrong?
pretty much. It's a worldview, or others would say it's a way. It's world sensing. It's a way in which you, even when you're not looking, the way in which you experience the world is, if you're a Christian, is very Christian. So you look at, for example, we're going to talk about African traditional religion. You look at the way in which Christians judge other religions and perceive them, and you see that there's an assumption that the Christian narrative is absolute. That's because for that individual, the world is Christian. And in a Christian world, certain figures are identified with Christ. Certain figures are identified as enemies of Christ. I think you get the point that I'm getting at. So, being Christian, there is a sense in which it can refer to seeing and sensing and experiencing the world in a certain way, even if you resist it. So I've even heard people say they are Christian atheists. Those who know Slavoj Žižek, a famous philosopher, he commonly refers to himself as a Christian atheist, which means, in as much as he doesn't believe there's a being called God who exists, the way in which he senses and experiences the world is still in the light of the Christian narrative in some sense. So yeah,
So you can
I
be
think
Christian without necessarily believing in God.
being Christian is a layered thing. So there is the sense in which I've just described, which is you can experience the world in a Christian way. That doesn't require for you to believe in God, or you could believe in God, but uh, not even be your own ideal version of a Christian. You know what I mean? So it's a layered thing. We shouldn't oversimplify it. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
I, I think if you can allow me to come in there, that part of me comes through from the viewpoint that is expressed in the Bible, where it says, let those that are saying that they're Christians and those that are claiming to be Christians but are not Christians, let them grow together. I think you find a lot of verses that would talk towards that judgment is not yours, but it belongs to the Lord. I think all of those were set in place because as much as Christ has come to die for everyone and everyone is fully accepting of that free gift, but at the end of the day, it is only God that really knows inside the heart who is really Christian. But I think when we put up a definition that is going to be all encompassing of everyone, we'll probably be walking along the precepts of the Bible, because the Bible is saying that we shouldn't discriminate or put others out of that definition because Christ has died for all of us. But I think as well, certain aspects of it need to be pushed to the future, where it is that God is the one that will separate the sheep from the goats. Then it will be truly revealed who it is that was falling along Christian lines. If you look at the life of Samson, for instance, is counted as one of the strong men of faith, even though the people that were alive with him at the time would have said this guy's a womanizer, a murderer, and all sorts of definitions. David as well is counted amongst the men of faith, even though his life was not particularly fitting towards the Christian agenda or the Christian narrative as we know it. So I think maybe we need to come up with a definition that doesn't exclude anyone, because at the end of it, we do not know who's gonna fall in and who won't. But at the same time, we need to actually push it back to a futuristic time that it will be revealed in time who is a Christian. So maybe putting the definition, you would say it's a group of people that are claiming to be following Jesus, but not all of them are until Jesus reveals who really is following him.
Emphasis on claiming.
Yeah, and it becomes tricky in the sense that who determines who is a Christian and who is not a Christian. who has the authority to make that distinguishing factor? Is it possible that humanity, often at times when it attempts to define Christianity, it falls into a trap of casting judgment on those who may not be aligned to my worldview of how I view Christ, of how I relate with Christ, of how I see Christ in my own personal life? Because it comes to the essence of whatever I say I am, and that may be aligned to who Christ is only defined by my own limited understanding of who Christ is, which may vary from another recipient of the very same Christ. Because how we view Christ is of a personal inclination. There can never be a collective understanding, because that collective understanding would need to be informed by our different inclination, our different dogma towards Christ, and every other facet that seems to align and say these are from this group and these are from another group. And that becomes too tricky, because we automatically enter into a cast and stone whereby we're able to cast a judgment on those who may not be aligned with whatever belief that we may have.
So I just to interject, gentlemen, is Christianity about actions, or is Christianity about purity of heart?
Whoa,
Is
you're
it
going to
something
another
internal?
room now.
Is it something internal, or is it something that germinates itself through action?
I think, and I'll try to be brief because I know that we're still going to go to the African traditionalist part, but I think in brief, Christianity is not monolithic. It's not. It's not. You can't put one hard and fast definition of what it is. I think when you ask questions of purity or something to do with the heart, we're starting to talk about the ideals of what Christian communities might have as an ideal. Uh, but I think the ideals are not do not fully define what Christianity is, because when you define something, you have to talk about what it wants to be, what the ideal is, and what it is practically in the here and now. I think Pastor Mabenge touched on that a little bit, but maybe my last comment would be to respond to what Pastor Khoji just said. Maybe it's something we should have emphasized more, but we've all touched on it. There's a personal aspect to being a Christian as well, which is what causes there to be so many differences. Uh, we confess one Christ, but not all Christians agree on the meaning of Christ. Who is Christ? Other Christians will tell you he's God the Son, but others will say no, Christ is not God. Christ is an angel. Uh, we confess God. Not all Christians agree about God. Others will tell you God is a Trinity, and others will tell you God is not a Trinity. Others will tell you the Holy Spirit is just an impersonal force. Others will tell you that's the third person of the Trinity. Even when we confess Christ, we don't mean the same thing. Secondly, in a socio-economic sense, there are differences even when we think we mean the same thing by Christ. You see this in modern day rhetoric. You hear people say there's a white Christ and there's a black Christ, uh, which means even when we both say by Christ we mean God the Son, we still don't mean the same thing by that. So there is that personal aspect, which is part of the reason why there are so many differences, which we can't count, uh, as to what Christianity is practically. The ideal of what Christianity should be, well, that's as myriad as the many different expressions of Christianity. If you talk to a Catholic, the ideal Christian is one thing, but if you talk to a Lutheran or a Seventh Day Adventist, it's another thing altogether. So, who has
So you're
who?
saying to me, Lord,
Okay,
sorry.
yeah, go
So
for it.
so basically, what you are saying, Lord, is that Christianity basically differs from one denomination to another.
Yes.
So there
It,
can
Yeah.
never be a blanket definition of what Christianity is. each denomination has its own definition of what Christianity is supposedly is.
And even
Is that what you're saying, Lord?
I'm saying that exactly, and it's even more complicated because even within one denomination, you don't people don't see eye to eye. Just in our denomination, the Seventh Day Adventist Church, you've got the more Harvard brand, the more militant brand of Adventism.
Gosh,
You've got the more evangelical brand of Seventh Day Adventism. And then you've got the more liberal or progressive brand of Adventism. So even amongst Adventists, we don't even agree in our own denomination. It's the same with Catholicism. You have Catholics who identify more with Vatican I and Catholics who identify more with Vatican II. So, yeah, even from individual to individual sometimes. So, to the extent where denominational differences break down at a certain level, because you'll find there are moments where you resonate more with people who are not even in your denomination than you do with people in your denomination.
I think though, coming back to what Pastor Kessel was talking about an inside relationship or Christianity being intrinsic, I think at some basic level it has to express itself in the way you do things, in your demeanor, so that you can be clearly defined from others that are not like Christian. Because if it doesn't express itself on the outside, then how different is it from everything else that is out there?
It's a matter of our hermeneutics, how we interpret Christ. That is pivotal in how we express Christ. And I guess more than anything, to align myself with what Utabane is saying, is often we have an impression of having an internal relationship that does not present itself to others as an affirmation that you are aligned, or you subscribe, or that you believe in a being that is Christ. And I guess more than anything, our personal inclinations should inform our actions. And those actions should reveal the kind of livelihood, or the kind of living we say that it is of Christ. And remember, we are speaking of the good news concerning a historical figure. How they understood and they perceived Christ in the early church is totally different to how we perceive Christ today. And that is informed by our socio-dynamics. It is informed by our spiritual inclinations. It is informed by every other facet that has a period in time that causes us to question where we align ourselves and what we understand as receiving the message of those good news.
I'd like to just come in and say, I remember when we were doing a missiology assignment, we had to go visit some other denomination, and when we got there, it was quite apparent that the people in that denomination do not actually read the Bible for themselves, but they take what they are being given by the pastor or the bishop of the denomination to be what Christianity is. So they still align themselves with Christianity. They still call themselves Christians, even though their expression is not what they have viewed for themselves from the Bible, but it's actually an expression of another over what the Bible is saying. And I think many of us, in some way or the other, carry that even though there's sermons, there's the Bible, there's different things that we see that express what Christianity should entail. Yet we carry more the traditions of our families, what our fathers or parents were defining Christianity to be. And if somebody doesn't fall along that definition or what we used to, then we exclude them outside of Christianity because it is not the norm of what we used to.
Maybe let me say, with every comment, I'm discovering that we have a lot to say about Christianity, because every comment makes me want to comment more. But maybe we should also maybe shift to the African part of the discussion, for a little bit of balance to the
Okay.
conversation.
But before we do that, Lord, just give us your short version of what Christianity is. That ex asnike yakhe, iragi asnike yakhe, nam dinike yam, and then we move on.
Okay.
Now, just summarize in summation what you say Christianity is. Just a young paragraph, young definition, and then we move on. Lord, I think give us yours, and then Taex, and then Urak, and then I'll close with mine.
Okay. I think that my closing statement on what Christianity is would be, it is primarily to encounter God through Jesus. And I think that influences how you read the Bible, that influences how you interpret the world and everything else. Yeah.
Thank you.
I
Bye-bye.
think I would say it's an internal relationship with God that is expressed through the encounter of Jesus Christ to the rest of society.
I guess for me, it would be as simple as an attempt to reveal the relationship that one has with Christ, that is reflective of the character of Christ, that is reflective of the person of Christ, that is reflective of what Christ has done. Now, this is not inclined with miracles or any other thing, but the salvific element of realizing who I am and the need for Him in my life, and how I reflect and represent that kind of a relationship to humanity.
Well, for me, Christianity then, in conclusion, is a confession of Christ as Lord and as ruler over your life and as the source of all human salvation.
That's not our conclusion. That's your conclusion, bro.
Oh, mine.
No, sure. No, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I guess let's have a different definition from one of us on what ATR, which would be African traditional religion, worldview, and what is our understanding of it. Probably you lead us, my lord, on that one.
Okay, awesome. I think the first thing I should do on behalf of all of us here on this panel is a disclaimer, which is that we are not anthropologists. We are not experts in African religion. We are not African scholars of African religions. We are students of theology. We are theologians. And I think theologians often make two mistakes when they analyze African traditional religion. One is, both of them stem from looking at it through the lens of Christianity. So the first mistake is to look at it through the lens of Christianity in a positive way by trying to interpret the major beats of traditional African traditionalism according to the Christian message. So you take, for example, the supreme being or the supreme God of African traditional religions, and you conflate that with Yahweh of the Hebrew Bible. I think you see where I'm going with that. That's maybe a positive mistake. The second one is you look at it through the Christian lens, and you make conclusions about it through the Christian narrative. So when people make reference to ancestors, you say, no, those are demons, not ancestors. Or when you look at the rituals, you say that those are all Antichrist rituals. And the mistake that they both make is that they don't look at African traditional religion on its own merits. And if you want to understand something different from you, you need to be willing to listen to it from its own merits, even if that means risking being offended by it. So I think maybe the last thing I'll say now, more in the direction of a definition, is the first. It's not just a religion. It's not just culture. It's not just a worldview. It's all three of those things packaged together. It's a way of life to the extent where when people are working, they do spiritual things. When people are doing spiritual things, they do material things. They don't compartmentalize religion and culture and even the way people dress in African traditional societies, even the ways that they eat, have some sort of connection with their spirituality. So I would say that, and yeah, maybe let me listen to others before I say more.
Yeah, as you clearly put it, the, 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 the African tradition is more informed, and its philosophy is more informed on the traditional livelihood, the essential background of an African person, how they relate with a divine being, how they have functioned in the presence of divinity as they understand it as Africans. And this is more on a framework that is not associated with what Christianity is, nor does it have interest to know what a Western deity may be. But it is more on how does an African relate to God? How does an African perceive God? How does an African practice its tradition of valuing the presence of God in one's life?
Thanks.
Oh, you're calling me out. Listen, for me, this was equally problematic because I don't see how we all as Africans can be put under one umbrella to believe in one thing. First of all, that's where I had a problem. But number two, I thought to myself that when the missionaries came into Africa, they did not bring and they brought their religion, but they brought it in a form that was more organized and that had dogma. But they did not actually bring us worship or spiritualism because we were already believing in a deity that is responsible for everything that is there. And we knew that we needed to relate with him so that everything that is around us can be okay. And then there came Christianity and the different religions that came through to sort of like give a more organized definition to that God, because the missionaries didn't come and say, no, Velinganga is not God. They actually embraced him. They did not come and say Kamata is not God. He's a different God. They embraced him as part of the Christian God. So I would say that my definition of African traditional religion would be what we believed in before the missionaries came through and gave us dogma, if I can be safe that way.
I think I subscribe to your definition as well, X. I think African traditional worldview is an African lens of viewing life, of defining values, of defining morals, and of defining ethics, and even of defining religion itself. Because Christianity is a religion on its own. That is a subset of Judaism. And then ATR is a religion which is a subset of Africanism. So I think for me, African traditional religion is how we viewed God before the colonial period came with a more Western definition of who God is. I think I lean towards that definition.
Maybe let me
And I
just.
guess more,
Okay.
and I guess, my lord, before you come in, it's uh, the ATR comes way before Christianity. It is embedded in the formation, in the makeup of Africa. I mean, like you look at the Ethiopian in the Bible. who goes to Jerusalem to worship. And you start to realize that the African himself, as an Ethiopian, had already understood how to relate with God, you know, and it transcend that. It is not parallel with Christianity, but ATR has been there before Christianity could come in, could be furnished by missionaries, could be furnished by the colonial elements of the time. But more than anything, the African tradition has always been about how do we worship as Africans? How do we worship this deity? How do we worship this being? How do we relate with them as an African? And I think that's where we should be more inclined to discuss. My Lord.
I think where I can come in as well, you know, when you speak of the Ethiopian eunuch, is the fact that maybe the reason why African traditional religion was easily influenced by Christianity, it's because the custodian of the dogma in African traditional religion are the spiritual mediaries, the sangomas, or whatever that you may call them in the different cultures and so forth. And they're the ones that actually bring guidance over what needs to be done. So there's no one set way of going and approaching that God. And I think what Christianity did that was very, clever, was the fact that they didn't come and deny it, but instead they came and they brought meaning towards what the African was actually believing in. To say, actually, there is a way of actually going towards that God that doesn't need to go through that person. Now, I'm saying that these intermediaries, you would have to go with something to sacrifice or with a gift of some sort so that you can be actually given direction over what God wants in your life. But now Christianity comes through and it says to them, listen, you actually don't have to do all of that. We can give you a shortcut. This is how you can get to him through the person of Jesus Christ. So I'd like to say that the African traditional religion at the same time is highly dependent on those intermediaries between the people and the God that they believe in. And because of that, there is no one definition that you can contain in, because it depends on the person that you've gone to consult to actually check what God wants. And because those people differed in the way, you know, in Xhosa we say imizi yahlukana ngendlanti, meaning to actually do the same thing. You can do it a different way as long as the intermediary that has spoken with the deity has given you direction. Then that is the direction that will be taken by this home, which is not necessarily the same as other homes.
Maybe let me jump in and maybe let me cut a different trail. I want to talk about African traditional religion without maybe trying as best as I can to represent someone who has had no contact with Christianity. So I've done a little bit of reading on this, and I think a few of the things that I can throw out there to flesh this out a little bit is the traditional worldview in Africa looks at reality or the fiber of reality through which reality is constructed, either as something animistic or as something dynamistic. I'm going to explain what I mean by these two things. Animistic view of reality is that reality is permeated by spiritual beings. So when you pick up a rock, when you pick up a stone, there's a spiritual being in that rock in some sense. That's an animistic view. That's a view we find of reality in Central Africa, in Western Africa, and the more northern parts of Africa. Then there's the dynamistic view of reality, dynamism, which posits that reality is constructed or is composed of or is permeated by this neutral, impersonal, these neutral, impersonal spiritual forces. So animism looks at these forces as being personal, as being spiritual beings. But in dynamism, these are not beings, these are not personalities, these are just forces in reality. They are not good, they are not bad, they are not evil, they're just there. And some of the reading I've done suggests that this picture can be viewed as African communities are floating in an ocean. This is, of course, metaphorical language. Are floating in an ocean of these dynamistic forces and animistic forces. When we talk about Southern Africa, the most prevalent view of reality in Southern Africa is a dynamistic view of reality. So, one in which there are forces around us everywhere which are not personal. These are not spiritual beings, but these are just neutral forces. And here's the thing, these are forces that certain individuals can draw from. There are individuals who can draw from these forces to do harm. These are usually called witches or sorcerers. But there are also individuals who can draw from the same forces to heal and to bless. This is the view that Africans have of Isangoma, for example, or Amakwele, such people who draw on dynamistic power for the good of the community. So the community floats on this dynamistic power, which is a bit chaotic because it's not good, it's not evil. It can threaten to destroy us, but it can also bless us. We need people or individuals or figures who are able to use this power for the good of the communities. So that also introduces us to an ancestor, because ancestors are believed by Africans to have the ability to draw.
Wait, my lord.
Okay, sorry.
Wait. Before we get to the ancestors, let's still deal with what you're giving me. You know, as you're talking now of the dynamism and the animistic nature of ATR, I can't help but look at it as though that is a Westerner's view of what Africans are actually doing. But in my viewpoint, I still stand to be corrected. But I feel that the ATR that I'm exposed to, especially here in the South, it doesn't really relate with the dynamism aspect that you're putting down or the animistic aspect, because we believe that there are forces, both evil and good. We believe that there are certain objects that powers can dwell in so that you can use them towards whatever influence. But I think we've always believed that there is that one deity that is bigger than all, that is in charge, and that is the creator of everything. And I feel that when we define ATR in terms of dynamism and animistic characteristic, we sort of like miss out on that actual aspect of looking at one deity that is in charge of everything, and then with sub-deities that could belong in the dynamistic nature and so forth. So every time I hear people talking about the dynamism of ATR and the animistic nature, it brings to me a sort of like feeling as though that is the attempt of Westerners to try and describe ATR, but not necessarily what we really experience. Because as much as we've got ancestors, as much as we've got evil and bad spirits, we always had a belief that there is that one creator God that is in charge of everything. And when there was an issue that is affecting the whole nation, then we would send out certain people in the society, in the village or wherever it is, to go up in the mountain so that they can go and do rituals that are going to appease that one person that is not a Khadebe or a Dabane or a Mutsweding, that belongs to all of us, you know? So yeah, I'm just, yeah.
Okay. I think Oh, sorry, my lord. Yes.
No, go ahead, my lord. I'll come
Oh,
after you.
okay. I think from where I was coming from, I, I was first describing the dynamistic aspect, but then I was gonna go to the ancestor, then the supreme being, because all three of these are actually a part of African reality, and they work together. Uh, Maybe let me say something about the supreme being, which is uh, the sum total or the source of the dynamistic reality for Africans is the supreme being, because the supreme being is the source of everything in the African view. But here's maybe where my understanding differs from yours just a little bit. Uh, I think it is a Christianization of African traditional religion to think that when Africans made sacrifices, they made them to the supreme being. Because the best evidence we have seems to suggest that Africans consistently conceive of the supreme being as being distant, as being non-relational, unlike the Christian God. Uh, and for that matter, ancestors are not conceived by Africans before Africa made contact with Christianity. We're not conceived as mediators between human beings and the supreme being. No, ancestors had authority of their own. They made their own rules, and sometimes these rules differed from ancestor to ancestor. And communities believed when bad things happened that they were being punished by particular ancestors. And I've even come across some research that even suggests that not all ancestors are considered to be benevolent, to be good. Some ancestors are even considered to be bad, to the extent that in some African tribes you have rituals that can kill an ancestor who's believed to be harmful. Which is to say, these ancestors don't need a signature from the supreme God, the supreme being, before they make laws that they expect their progeny to live by, but they draw on their own authority. So I think I'm trying my best to be careful not to Christianize African traditional, not to view it through a Christian lens, which is impossible because I'm a Christian. But I think it has that dynamistic aspect. Then there's the ancestral aspect. Then there's the supreme being who is very distant but present always and the source of everything. Maybe let me listen to others as well.
I think we can safely agree that there's no absolute definition for ATR. And it is informed by the various ideologies that play part in different sectors of the continent itself. I mean, like you clearly said, my lord, that in the northern or the western aspects of Africa, they have a different understanding of some of the forms, whereas in the southern also you have different understanding of the various forms. For instance, I grew up in a family that is very conservative traditionalist, and the understanding of ancestors is that they are mediaries between them and God, and our only access to God is through them. Not refuting the fact that they are ancestors who influence them to do bad things or cause some bad things to happen to them. But there are still those who would like to see peace, who would still love to advance love, justice, and all those things. And every time they present it within their household, it is to try by all means to appease the ancestors, so that whenever they need to then speak to God, those ancestors are the ones that make the message or convey the message to the supreme God. So it is also kind of difficult for us to then say ATR is this, simply because of the different cultures. This is something I had hoped we were going to address. We come from different societies. We come from different communities, and our communities inform how we treat and understand ATR. Those communities are embedded in how society live ethically, should live morally. And I think Pastor Keswa made mention of these elements, because it is a way of life defined and crafted by how we are relating as African people. Thank you.
I think
So I think there's a similarity that we can draw between ATR and Christianity. Because in our discussion of Christianity, we had alluded to the fact that each denomination defines its own Christianity. So I think we can also take that understanding, that key point, and apply it to ATR as well. And further on say that each culture, each African culture defines its own ATR. Because when we're speaking of African traditional religion, in Africa, there is a number of cultures that have their own way of living, have their own understanding of God, have their own definition of values, morals, and so forth. So I think we can also lean towards that definition of ATR, that there can never be a blanket statement of what ATR is, but each definition is dependent upon the culture that seeks to define what ATR is.
I think though I want to lean more towards my Lord, um, when he was saying that that supreme being was a distant being from the society, because I really believe that. And when I was talking about the rituals and the sacrifices, they were not actually meant for him. They were meant for the characters that are going towards him. Because in other words, they had to be made strong so that they are able to go and communicate with him. But I've never heard of a ritual that is performed that is going towards God. I think also, Pastor Keso, what you're talking about, the fact that each custom, has got its own understanding. I think there must be some form of ATR that doesn't even recognize that supreme deity, but only recognizes its own ancestors as its own gods. And they feel as though that is where it ends, and it doesn't translate to being for them to be intermediaries or anything of that sort. Yes, you were saying.
I've never come across a kind of ATR that is atheistic in its definition of ATR.
You're a Christian. You're too much of a Christian. That's why.
To me, it sounds like you are saying there is some type of ATR or some type of culture that does not believe in a supreme being, which is not my understanding of ATR, because all the ATRs that I've come across all believe in one supreme being. But how we access that supreme being differs from culture to culture. So andiyazi noba mhlawumbe ikhona i-ATR engabhiliviyo kuThixo. I don't know.
Okay, check this, ne? That's why I was talking about dynamism, and that it is sort of like a Westerner's view, because I know that the Greeks had a different God for different situations and not really one supreme God, if you can put it that way. So there was a supreme being that was in charge of certain things. You had Zeus, you had, don't take me back to class, I forgot the other ones. But all I'm trying to say is that I think this is the same situation here in Africa as well. Not everyone believes in one supreme being. Other people believe that even the sea is a god, without necessarily having a supreme being that is in charge of creating that sea. Whether it is that they don't go that far in their religion, or maybe, I don't know. But end of the day, I don't want to put ourselves in a box where we are saying all Africans believe that there must be one supreme being. Because when we go to the different homes, the others put more emphasis in their own ancestors, because those are the gods that they know. So they treat their own ancestors as gods, not even as intermediaries. They're not saying talk for us to God. They are saying we are appealing to you to make sure that everything is fine here. Look after us here. Give us healing here. They are not saying we want you to actually translate this message for us to another God. So maybe in thought, or I don't know, in their organization, they might be saying that actually translate the message to that God. But I don't want to also lean on the understanding that we are coming with that Judo-Christian understanding that every African believes that there is only one supreme maker. Because I feel that we will be moving away from animism as well, which you can look at a tree and say that kind of tree is your God, and that's it. I don't know.
Maybe let me just jump in and say I think we need to also. I think that the way in which the discussion is going, I think we've muddled a few things, or haven't differentiated a few things. I can hear that in some of the things we say, we're talking more about the state of African traditionalism today, in the present, and in some of the things we say, we're talking about African traditionalism pre-colonialism, before colonialism. I think most of the things I have said are more of an attempt by scholars to reconstruct what African traditional religion was like before it made contact with Christianity. So most of the literature that I've consulted are people who are trying to reconstruct that. I think a lot of what I've heard from, or maybe all three of you, speaks more to the state of African traditional religion today. Uh, of course, also, these are not completely different things, But let me also move from that and say the thing with animism, which was the view that everything had some sort
My
of
Lord,
spiritual.
sorry, man, before you move on, just so that I don't miss you,
Okay.
are you saying that the definition of ATR can only come from what they are deconstructing in the past?
No.
Or is it something that can be viewed in how the religion is practiced today so that we can seek for a definition?
No, no. Okay. I'm not saying that the true definition is what it was in the past. I'm giving whoever's watching this conversation some sort of a map to say uh, when you listen to the comments that, let's say, Pastor Mabenge made, it's more of a description of where we are today with African traditional religion.
Okay.
Religion.
Okay.
When you listen to the comments I made, it's more of a description of what it was like. So I think the discussion as a whole gives us a more holistic view with a historical component and a present day component. That's what I was trying to express.
Okay.
Yes,
All right.
yes, yes. So with the animistic view, these spiritual beings are not viewed as gods. But they are power which is personified. But there is something over and above them, which is God, and ancestors, which are over and above them. And in fact, one of the reasons in those animistic cultures that ancestors have to be appeased and remembered is so that is because when ancestors are forgotten, when you forget their name and when you forget them, they become animistic spirits, wandering aimlessly. The ancestor needs the community for relevance, just as much as the community needs the ancestor, because the African worldview is very communal. Ancestors are not sovereign to the extent where they can do without the community. And even I referred earlier to a ritual which some African traditions have, where they can even kill an ancestor. The Venda version of that ritual consists of forgetting the ancestor. That's how you kill an ancestor, by refusing to acknowledge them. Which means, and maybe let me say a word or two about ancestors, because I don't think we can talk about African traditional religion and not flesh out ancestors. I've heard, for example, Pastor Mabenge mentioned that for some people, ancestors are probably it, and to the point where maybe there's not even a conception of a supreme deity. And I've come across that even in some of my literature that I've read. Uh, I've also come across the idea. I've also come across the idea that the ancestors are, for others, are even demigods. One author went. I don't know who would agree with this or disagree with this, but one of the authors spoke about how when you look at how the in the Tswana language and Sotho language, they talk about Badimo as the ancestors and Modimo as the supreme being. There's sort of a common root between the two names to imply that Badimo can even be seen as gods, mini gods or demigods, but not everyone agrees with that view, and for me it's neither here nor there. But here's what I want to say about the ancestor before I pass it on to someone else. Ancestors should not be viewed in a Christian lens as well. Even though, let me make this disclaimer, even adherents to African traditional religion have a lot of them have a very Christianized view of what an ancestor is because of the colonial project and because of the work of the missionaries. But if you want to trace a more historical understanding of what ancestors have been, and an understanding that still subsists today amongst many traditional groups, and ancestors, and it's not the same thing as life after death or the immortal soul that we find in many Christian denominations. It's not that, because as I've already hinted, ancestors are not immortal. Ancestors can die. Secondly, one very, I think, clear definition I found, or description of ancestors, which is held in common by many groups of Africans, is what makes an ancestor is siriti. That's what they call it in Sesotho. Isithunzi in isiXhosa, shadow, the shade that they cast. Something that towers over you casts a shadow down on you. So the shade refers to the authority and how much this figure in authority towers over you, so much so that they cast their shadow on you. So in Sesotho it's more explicit, because a person's shade, it's even the word that can be used for authority, or and that shade, that weight, the weight of their presence, of their authority, that's the key to what it means to be an ancestor. Because in the literature that I consulted, I discovered that not everyone who dies becomes an ancestor in most African traditional conceptions. It's only those who were figures of authority in life that when they die, the weight of their siriti, the weight of their shadow, continues even after death. And because of the personal nature of your authority, there's a sense in which your personality subsists after you die. So that's the conception of an ancestor. But it's not a spirit that escapes the body when a person dies, because all over Africa, there are rituals which are even practiced to this day. When you bury someone who is about to become an ancestor, or about to be considered an ancestor beyond death, they would be buried with tools, they would be buried with weapons, they would be buried with food and even drink. This is a way of, even in the southern part of Africa, Emhlandi, they even pour some alcohol to the ground for the ancestors to drink, which is a way of saying the conception of an African on what an ancestor is escapes the dichotomy of spirit and physical, of material and immaterial. Because how can an ancestor be nourished by food and drink if it's just an immaterial spirit? How can it use weapons? How can he use weapons and tools? That dichotomy, and blankets. That dichotomy is a Western dichotomy that we get through Christianity. But the African, even when a child has a vision where an ancestor comes and says they are hungry, they see the ancestor in bodily form. It's not a disembodied spirit floating around. They describe the physical attributes of this ancestor. So it's very confusing. But yeah, ancestors are, it's not life after death in the Christian sense. Not everyone gets this. It's those who are key figures in the community, who are able to draw on, not on animistic power, but on dynamistic power, which is not which is the neutral power, which is neither good nor evil, but can be harnessed for the good of the society or for the family. Maybe let me leave it there.
Yeah.
I think, okay.
Yeah, I think more than anything, as I alluded to earlier on, is that from ATR is more communal in definition.
Yes.
And this, but I mean, it is formed by a particular grouping, a particular people who have different inclinations or who have different perceptions, who have different ideologies of how they perceive all these ideals of Africa or of Africans. Because what I'm trying to express is what we define as ancestors in every community may differ.
Yes.
Same applies with rituals. In every community, it will differ. Same applies with practices. But the essence of an African is to attempt to worship as best as they can in order to gain something in an African and to order to also have a livelihood from that particular worship. And I think more than anything, it is how Africans relate to religion, to their own religion, that becomes the definition of what ATR stands for.
I think,
Oh,
I think to,
okay.
okay, I think to come in there, I really need to learn more about the death of the ancestors, because like the way we in the Southern African community, you know, everyone sort of like venerates everyone that has died. They never have this seclusion of saying no, that one, you know. But I do believe that because it is not one discipline under ATR, there can be many facets that are looking at it. But I would like to say though that when you look at how people endear the clan names and how they hold on to them, it's because of the belief that these are people that are still alive in another world, that are in their lineage, that are able to give them guidance in this life and will also protect them in the afterlife. Now, if they die in that afterlife, then it means that, is that where it ends? Like,
Yes.
my Lord, I really just wanted to be clear, like when they believe that they can kill the ancestor, does it mean that there is a finality and a mortality to a spirit? Meaning that you if you don't make it here, you go into the next one, but definitely in the next one we kill you and that's it, you're done, you know? Or what's the issue? Because I think many people that are practicing African traditional religions are doing so out of the fear for the unknown world that they are going to go into. And they feel that they need to appease, not only for eventualities that will happen in this life, but also so that when they get to the other life, they do not get there and they are told that you are ostracized because you didn't do this and this and this and this for us whilst you were still in the other world.
You see, the thing with what the view that you just articulated, the scholars, the anthropologists of African traditional religion argue that that conception evolved when African traditional religion made contact with Christianity and with the missionaries. This eschatological conception that you live now in such a way that you earn a spot in the afterlife was not the way originally that these things were thought of. But it's now the present reality. Now this is how Africans think about it. Everybody who dies now becomes an ancestor, even children and everything. But or like before, according to the experts on this that I've consulted through reading, before contact with the missionaries, the idea was that the only individuals who became ancestors were individuals who had children, because they need to be recognized by their offspring in order to become ancestors. They need to have offspring who will recognize them as ancestors. In the absence of offspring, you can't be an ancestor. Then to come to the question of the mortality of an ancestor, very briefly before I hand it over to Lord Square, is again remember that this is not the same thing. At least before African traditional religion made contact with Christianity, there is no conception of eternal life for Africans. Uh, the only one who is eternal is the supreme being, and the ancestor is remembered to the fifth and to the sixth generation. Then beyond that, you find that we forget specific names, but we remember clan names. Uh, and when you look at even clan names, you find some of them were not names, but were a remembrance of characters. You find, for example, Ojola. One of their clan names is Mfazi Omabele Made, or
I,
which is a way of
Utomabele.
saying which was a way of saying that whichever ancestor is being recognized through that clan name was someone who provided for more than just her own children, which is also interesting because this is a feminine description, which means it wasn't just males who were recognized as ancestors. But I think I'm trying to say,
That's a scary thought, my lord. You know, when I think of Pastor Hodges' clan names, I'm thinking, what were they known for? Yo, but yeah, let me not even mention his clan name now.
Don't go there.
Please do. Please do.
I think
I guess one
Usbang
thing-
had something to say as well.
Yeah.
No,
closing-
gentlemen, I think for me, there's a question that arises now. After defining what Christianity is, and after seeking to also define what ATR is, the question that then arises for me, is it possible for one to be an African traditionalist Christian?
Well, we see a lot of them. What do you mean, is it possible? Of course it is.
Yeah, and I guess more than
How
anything,
so?
it's something that we seek to address in our next slot or program, whereby we're able to look at where we converge. When I say we, I'm talking about Christianity and ATR, you know, and where there's a divergence of worldviews or ideologies, because that will address your question to say, is it then possible to have these inclusion, or where do we place Christianity, where do we place ATR in relation to each other, and also in relation to the recipient who is formed out of these circles?
I think, gentlemen, maybe as my last word, I would say my persuasion towards Christianity over ATR, which I also have a lineage over, was based on a futuristic view of where am I going to end up. In other words, Christianity said that life is not ending here. It simply takes a pause upon death, and then it is realized as life eternal at the coming of Jesus Christ. And I think it became a more appealing thought to me than to actually die and become in the spiritual realm as an ancestor looking after people that are living. Now it's even worse. I might not even become an ancestor. I might even die. It's even worse now. So it's making me even more to want to lean this side, because here there is a promise of eternal life. But I think those are just thoughts that I think I bring over my personal influence as we conclude. But rightfully so, we are still going to go into this topic. But I think the main reason why we came here, it's not to be experts, but to actually throw around ideas so that we make other people as well to start thinking about other things, you know. So I don't want people to be looking at this and saying, no, this guy's a clown. What was he talking about? Or this one. We didn't come here as experts, but we came as people that are, you know, concerned. And besides, it's lockdown. We're bored.
And I guess just to add to what you're saying, it is a pursuit of knowledge. It is a pursuit for information. It is a pursuit to have a principled decision towards our understanding of our own personal inclinations and how we view life and how we want to live a life that is representative of what we affirm and what we associate ourselves with. And I guess more than anything, it is not a bad thing to critique our very own fundamentals as individuals in order for us to know very well why are we standing on them and what kind of a direction we need to take. And I think moving forward it will be easy for us to be more informed in what we take decisions of.
I think for me, I would close with the immortal words. I'm not sure if it's Aristotle or Plato, where he says, "A life unreflected upon is not worth living." So from time to time, it is necessary for us to engage in such topics, just to reflect on our beliefs, our ways of life, and just to also emphasize some of the principles that might be necessary for our faith and for the afterlife.
I think on my end, before I make my closing remarks, I want to thank the three of you for the candid conversation, and I can't wait until we pick it up again and discuss the next parts, because I even lose all conception of time when I'm discussing these things with you. And I also want to thank the viewers who are watching this. And maybe you should leave some questions there, and maybe we can pick them up in the next session. But my closing remarks will be, we have to think about things that even offend us, such as these. We have to think them through, even if they offend other people, because in the pursuit for truth, we have to risk being offensive. Those are my last words.
Yeah, my lord.
I think we're done, gentlemen. West side, west side, west side, stand up.
All right.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Sure.
All right.